Commander Zach Thule stood in the command center of his massive warship and looked at the blue planet floating in space before him. His scaled hands moved across the control panel as he studied the data about this world called Earth. The reports showed that the humans living there had only recently learned to travel between stars. Their technology was primitive compared to his own people, the Vorthak. This should be an easy conquest. Zach Thule had fought in many wars across the galaxy. He had defeated 17 different worlds and brought them under the control of the hegemony. His reputation as a brilliant military commander was known throughout the Empire. Other species feared him. When they saw his ships coming, they usually surrendered without a fight. The few who tried to resist never lasted long against his superior weapons and tactics. Lieutenant Commander Veltar approached him with a concerned expression on his reptilian face. Veltar had served under Zach Thule for many years and was one of the few who dared to question his decisions. He held a datapad in his clawed hands and spoke in their native language. "Commander, I have been reading the intelligence reports about these humans. There is something that worries me about them." Zach Thule turned his yellow eyes toward his second in command. "What concerns you about such a primitive species?" The reports mention that humans are extremely violent creatures. They have spent most of their history fighting wars against each other. Even now, when they should be united against us, some of their nations are still in conflict. They seem to enjoy violence in a way that other species do not. Zach Thule made a dismissive gesture with his hand. "Violence without technology is meaningless. Look at their ships. They are made of crude metal and powered by chemical reactions. Their weapons fire solid projectiles instead of energy beams. Their armor is basic metal plating that our weapons can cut through like paper. What good is their violent nature when they cannot even scratch our shields?" Veltar nodded, but still looked worried. "Yes, sir, but the reports also mention that they refuse to follow the standard rules of warfare that civilized species use. They fight in ways that seem illogical and wasteful." "All primitive species fight foolishly," Zach Thule replied. "Once they see the power of our weapons, they will surrender just like all the others. We will be back in hegemony space within a month with another victory to add to our record." Far away on Earth, Admiral Jake Morrison sat in his command center watching the alien ships approach. The detection satellites had spotted them 3 days ago at the edge of the solar system. Since then, every attempt to communicate with them had failed. The aliens did not respond to any messages in any language or frequency. Morrison was an old soldier who had fought in several wars between Earth nations before humanity had united under a single government. He had gray hair and scars on his face from battles fought long ago. He knew the look of an invasion fleet when he saw one. These aliens had not come to talk. Captain Lisa Rodriguez stood beside him looking at the tactical display. She commanded the forward reconnaissance squadron and had been the first to encounter the alien ships. Her pilots had tried to make peaceful contact, but the aliens had responded by charging their weapon systems. "Sir, they have over 200 ships of various sizes. Their largest vessels are easily 10 times bigger than anything we have. Our weapons tests against their hull material show that they have some kind of energy shielding that stops our missiles and projectiles. We cannot penetrate their defenses with conventional weapons." Morrison nodded grimly. "What about their weapons?" Colonel Pete Williams answered from his position at the Defense Coordination Station. "From what we observed during the probe encounters, they use some form of directed energy weapons. The beams cut through our ship hulls like they were made of paper. A single shot from their smaller ships can destroy one of our cruisers." Morrison looked around the room at his officers. These were good people who had trained their whole lives for this moment. None of them expected to face an enemy so far beyond their technological level. But they were soldiers, and soldiers fought even when the odds were impossible. "Send a message to all ships and planetary defense stations. Tell them to prepare for combat. If these aliens want a fight, we will give them one." Captain Ben Carter spoke up from the communications station. "Sir, We are receiving a transmission from the alien fleet. They are broadcasting on multiple frequencies. Put it on the main screen. The image of Zakthul appeared on the display. The reptilian alien spoke in perfect English, though his voice had a strange hissing quality. I am Commander Zakthul of the Hegemony Fleet. Your world has been selected for incorporation into our empire. Surrender immediately, and your population will be allowed to live as workers under our rule. Resistance will result in the complete destruction of your species. Morrison stepped forward and activated the reply channel. This is Admiral Jake Morrison of the Earth Defense Force. We reject your demands. Earth belongs to humanity, and we will fight to defend it. Zakthul seemed amused by this response. You cannot hope to defeat us with your primitive technology. Look around you and see the size of my fleet. Surrender now and avoid unnecessary suffering. Morrison looked directly into the alien's yellow eyes. Come and take it! The transmission ended and both fleets prepared for battle. On his command ship, Zakthul gave orders to begin the attack. He expected the humans to surrender after the first demonstration of his superior firepower. Instead, the human ships moved to attack positions and opened fire with everything they had. The battle was completely one-sided. Zakthul's energy weapons sliced through human ships while their return fire bounced harmlessly off his shields. Within 2 hours, he had destroyed half of Earth's orbital defense platforms and most of their fleet. The few surviving human ships retreated toward their planet. Zakthul opened another communication channel to demand their surrender. He was confident that after seeing such overwhelming defeat, the humans would accept the reality of their situation. Instead, Admiral Morrison appeared on the screen again, his face covered in blood from a head wound, but his expression still defiant. Is that all you have, alien? We are just getting started. 3 weeks had passed since the first battle, and Zakthul was beginning to feel frustrated. He had won every major engagement against the human fleet. But the war was far from over. Instead of surrendering after their crushing defeat, the humans had changed their tactics in ways that made no sense to any civilized military doctrine. Captain Ben Carter had become a legend among the human resistance fighters. Instead of trying to fight the alien ships in traditional space battles, he loaded old transport vessels with nuclear warheads and flew them directly into hegemony formations. The humans called these suicide runs, and they were having a terrible effect on alien morale. Zakthul's crews never knew when a harmless-looking cargo ship might suddenly accelerate toward them and explode with the force of a small star. This is madness, Veltar said as he reviewed the latest battle reports. They are destroying their own ships and killing their own people just to damage a few of our vessels. No rational species would waste resources like this. Zakthul studied the tactical displays showing the current positions of both fleets. The humans had abandoned all attempts to hold territory or protect their major installations. Instead, they had scattered into small groups that attacked his supply lines and then disappeared before he could respond. It was like fighting smoke. Lieutenant Amy Foster was making his life even more difficult with her cyber attacks. Somehow, the human computer experts had found ways to interfere with hegemony systems that should have been completely incompatible with Earth technology. Their viruses and logic bombs were primitive by galactic standards, but they worked by exploiting flaws that no civilized species would have looked for. The humans thought like criminals and savages, which allowed them to break into systems that had been secure for centuries. Sir, we have another problem, Veltar reported. The humans have captured one of our supply convoys. They are using our own weapons against us now. This was another disturbing development. When civilized species were defeated, they usually accepted their fate and tried to minimize further damage. The humans seemed to view every defeat as a learning experience. They studied captured hegemony technology with frightening speed and found ways to turn it against its makers. Major Rick Thompson had organized resistance cells all across Earth's surface. Even in cities that Zakthul's forces had completely occupied, humans continued to fight from underground tunnels and hidden bases. They used improvised explosive devices made from household chemicals and attacked hegemony patrols with primitive weapons that should not have been effective against advanced armor. But the humans had learned that advanced armor had weak points. They studied the joints and sensors until they found ways to disable or destroy equipment worth more than entire human cities using nothing but scrap metal and determination. Every day brought new reports of hegemony soldiers being killed by traps and ambushes that no military academy had prepared them for. Dr. Nina Wells was perhaps the most dangerous human of all. As a xenobiologist, she had spent her career studying alien life forms, but now she focused all her knowledge on finding weaknesses in hegemony equipment and tactics. She discovered that Vorthak soldiers had excellent night vision, but were temporarily blinded by certain light frequencies. She found that their energy shields had a cycle time that allowed projectiles through if they were fired at exactly the right moment. Most importantly, she learned that the aliens depended heavily on their technology and became confused when forced to fight without it. Zak Thul had been forced to request reinforcements from the hegemony high command, something that had never happened before in his career. The message he received in return was not encouraging. His superiors were beginning to question his competence. How could a veteran commander with overwhelming technological superiority take so long to defeat a primitive species? The answer came during the Battle of Luna, when Captain Steve Baker led a desperate attack against Zak Thul's flagship. Baker had taken a civilian mining ship and packed it with every nuclear weapon the human resistance could spare. His plan was simple and insane in equal measure. He would fly directly at the most heavily defended ship in the alien fleet and ram it. Zak Thul watched the primitive ship approach and felt confident that his defenses would stop it long before it became a threat. His energy weapons fired continuously, but Baker had covered his ship with reflective material that scattered the beams. His point defense systems launched hundreds of interceptor missiles, but Baker flew through the explosions as if they were fireworks. The human ship smashed into the Dominion's edge with tremendous force. The nuclear explosion that followed killed 300 Vorthak crew members and left a massive hole in the side of Zak Thul's command vessel. For the first time in his military career, the great commander felt something he had never experienced before: fear. Baker's ship had been destroyed in the attack, of course, but the humans treated his death as a victory rather than a loss. They broadcast recordings of the attack to every resistance cell on Earth and throughout the solar system. The message was clear: even the mighty hegemony flagship could be hurt if you were willing to pay the price. Zak Thul realized that he was fighting an enemy that did not think like any other species he had encountered. Most civilized races fought to achieve specific goals: territory, resources, or political advantage. When the cost became too high, they would negotiate or surrender. The humans seemed to be fighting for the simple principle that nobody else could have their world. They would rather destroy everything than let it fall into alien hands. This became clear when Zak Thul attempted to capture the city of New Tokyo intact. He wanted to use it as an example of hegemony generosity toward cooperative populations. Instead, the humans rigged the entire city with explosives and detonated them just as his troops were moving in. 2 million people died in the blast, but they took 40,000 Vorthak soldiers with them. They killed their own civilians, Veltar said in shock as he reviewed the casualty reports. What kind of species destroys its own cities rather than let them be captured? Zak Thul stared at the smoking crater where New Tokyo had been and tried to understand the human mind. In all his years of warfare, he had never encountered an enemy willing to pay such prices for tactical advantages that seemed meaningless. A city was valuable because of the population and infrastructure it contained. An empty crater had no value to anyone. But the humans were not fighting for cities or resources. They were fighting for something much more dangerous: the idea that they could not be conquered. Every sacrifice they made, no matter how costly, reinforced this belief and made them more determined to continue fighting. Captain Danny Rodriguez had been shot down 3 times, but each time he had somehow escaped and stolen another ship too, Continue fighting. Lieutenant Kate Johnson had been working 18 hours a day to reverse engineer hegemony technology, and her breakthroughs were allowing human forces to adapt at an alarming rate. Colonel Lucy Hayes led boarding parties that captured alien vessels through close combat tactics that should have been suicidal but somehow worked. Zach Thole looked at the battle reports and realized that his easy conquest had become a nightmare. The humans were learning faster than he could adapt to their changes. Worse, his own forces were beginning to show signs of stress and fear that were unknown in Vorthok military culture. Some of his soldiers had started requesting transfers to other assignments. Others had begun making mistakes that would have been unthinkable at the start of the campaign. He was winning every battle but losing the war, and he did not know how to stop it. 6 months into the war, Zach Thule barely recognized the conflict he was fighting. What had started as a simple conquest had become a brutal grinding campaign that consumed resources and personnel at an alarming rate. The humans had not won a single major battle, yet somehow they were stronger now than they had been at the beginning. Engineer Kate Johnson had achieved what should have been impossible. Working with salvaged hegemony equipment in underground laboratories, she had successfully reverse-engineered their shield technology. It had taken the Vorthak centuries to develop those shields, but Johnson had cracked the fundamental principles in just weeks. Now, human ships were beginning to appear with crude but functional energy barriers that could stop some of the lighter hegemony weapons. Pilot Danny Rodriguez had become a nightmare for Zach Thule's fighter squadrons. Rodriguez had studied recordings of every engagement and identified the weaknesses in Vorthak combat doctrine. The aliens had become so accustomed to technological superiority that their pilots had grown lazy and predictable. Rodriguez taught human pilots to exploit this overconfidence by using tactics that seemed suicidal, but worked because alien pilots never expected anyone to be crazy enough to try them. The psychological impact on hegemony forces was becoming severe. Zach Thule's medical officers reported increasing numbers of soldiers requesting treatment for something they called combat stress. This was a condition that had never been documented in Vorthak military history. His species had always fought clean, technological wars where casualties were light and victory was achieved through superior equipment and tactics. They were not prepared for the meat grinder that Earth had become. Commander Lucy Hayes was making the situation worse with her boarding operations. The humans had learned that hegemony ships were designed to fight at long range and were vulnerable once enemy forces got inside. Hayes led teams of human marines who used captured transport pods to board alien vessels and fight their way to critical systems. The narrow corridors and close quarters, fighting favored human tactics over alien technology. Zach Thule watched surveillance footage of one such boarding action and felt sick to his stomach. The humans fought like wild animals, using knives and chemical explosives in spaces where energy weapons were too dangerous to use. His own troops, trained for civilized warfare, were unprepared for the savage brutality of hand-to-hand combat. Many of them froze or panicked when faced with enemies who seemed to enjoy violence for its own sake. The intelligence reports from Sarah Kim were equally disturbing. The human spy networks had somehow maintained communication and coordination despite orbital surveillance that should have made such operations impossible. Kim had organized resistance cells that operated independently but could still coordinate major operations across multiple continents. Her people used primitive radio equipment and coded messages that were hidden in normal civilian communications. Dr. Rachel Murphy had made a discovery that changed everything. While studying captured hegemony command protocols, she had identified a critical weakness in how the aliens organized their forces. The Vorthak military depended on centralized command structures where individual units rarely operated independently. When communication was cut or commanders were killed, entire formations would become confused and ineffective. Murphy shared this information with human forces throughout the solar system, and they immediately began targeting hegemony command nodes and communication arrays. What had once been a disciplined alien war machine began to fragment as isolated units struggled to function without detailed orders from higher authority. Medic Tony Clark was treating an increasing number of human prisoners who had escaped from hegemony detention facilities. Their stories revealed another human characteristic that Zach Thule found disturbing. The aliens had assumed that capturing human soldiers would remove them from the war, but the humans kept escaping through methods that seemed impossible. They picked locks, dug tunnels, overpowered guards, and found ways to break out of facilities that had held prisoners from dozens of other species without incident. The breaking point came when General Frank Roberts coordinated a planet-wide uprising that struck every hegemony position simultaneously. Instead of concentrating their forces for maximum effectiveness, the humans spread themselves across hundreds of targets and attacked them all at once. By any rational military standard, this should have been suicide. Divided forces were weak. Forces and the aliens should have been able to defeat each group separately. But the humans were not trying to win through superior tactics or firepower. They were trying to create chaos and confusion on a scale that would overwhelm the hegemony. Command structure. Roberts had realized that if he could force the aliens to fight dozens of small battles at the same time, their centralized command system would break down under the load. Zach Thule found himself trying to coordinate responses to attacks on mining, facilities, orbital platforms, supply depots, communication centers, and troop bases all across the solar system. His staff was overwhelmed by the flood of reports and requests for reinforcements. Units that had been trained to follow detailed battle plans were suddenly forced to make independent decisions, and most of them were not prepared for such responsibility. Colonel Beth Martinez had trained civilian militias using captured hegemony weapons, and these irregular forces were causing havoc behind alien lines. They did not fight like soldiers, which made them almost impossible to predict or counter. A group of farmers with stolen energy rifles could disappear into terrain they knew better than any orbital survey could map. Factory workers could sabotage equipment in ways that were not detectable until critical systems failed at the worst possible moments. The most disturbing reports came from Dr. Mike Carter, who had been developing weapons that violated basic principles of physics as the hegemony understood them. Carter had realized that human science had developed along different lines than galactic standard, and some of their theories suggested possibilities that more advanced species had dismissed as impossible. His prototype weapons were crude and unreliable, but they worked in ways that hegemony defenses were not designed to stop. Tactician Janet Phillips had been studying hegemony psychology and developing strategies based on fear rather than destruction. Phillips understood that the aliens were not prepared for the kind of war humanity was fighting, and she began designing operations that would maximize psychological impact rather than tactical advantage. Her goal was not to destroy the enemy, but to convince them that continuing the war was impossible. Captain Alex Turner led the most audacious operation of the war when he attempted to capture a hegemony command ship using nothing but modified civilian craft and nuclear weapons. The plan was insane and had almost no chance of success, but Turner had calculated that even the attempt would force the aliens to divert resources to defend against similar attacks in the future. The assault failed, but it succeeded in its real purpose. Zach Thule was forced to reassign 3 squadrons of his best ships to protect high-value targets, removing them from offensive operations. The humans had learned that they did not need to win battles to achieve strategic goals. They just needed to force the aliens to fight the kind of war that favored human strengths over hegemony. Advantages. Commander Mary Johnson was coordinating the evacuation of non-combatants to hidden colonies in the outer solar system. This was not a retreat, but a strategic repositioning that would allow the war to continue even if Earth itself fell. Johnson had realized that as long as humans survived somewhere, they could continue fighting and eventually rebuild their forces. Zach Thule stared at the tactical displays and tried to understand what had gone wrong. His forces still controlled most of Earth's major cities and had destroyed the majority of human military assets. By any objective measure, he was winning the war. But his troops were demoralized, his supply lines were under constant attack, and his superiors were demanding explanations for why a simple conquest had become such a costly campaign. He was beginning to understand that he had never really known what war was. All his previous victories had been achieved through technological superiority and conventional tactics. The humans had taught him that real war was not about weapons or strategy, but about the will to continue fighting no matter what the cost. And in that kind of war, a species that had evolved from persistence hunters would always have the advantage. The war had been raging for over a year when War Master Kethamor arrived with reinforcements and new orders from the Hegemony High Command. Kethamor was known throughout the Empire as a brutal commander who specialized in putting down rebellions through overwhelming force and terror tactics. His reputation for ruthlessness was legendary, and his arrival meant that the Hegemony leadership had grown tired of Zak Thul's prolonged campaign. Kethamor brought with him planet-killer weapons and authorization to exterminate humanity entirely if necessary. The massive vessels in his fleet carried enough firepower to crack continents and boil away oceans. Their arrival should have ended the war in a matter of days, but the humans had spent months preparing for exactly this escalation. Captain Jim. Watson had been working with a team of human scientists to develop countermeasures against genocide weapons. They could not match the raw power of hegemony planet killers, but they had found ways to interfere with the targeting systems and energy, focusing arrays that made such weapons possible. Watson's plan was desperate and required perfect timing, but it was the only chance humanity had. Zak Thul watched from his command bridge as Kethamor's forces moved into position around Earth. The War Master had made it clear that he considered the human resistance to be a minor annoyance that would be crushed through proper application of force. He had dismissed Zak Thul's warnings about human tactics as the excuses of a commander who had lost his nerve. These primitives have caused you problems only because you have been too soft with them, Kethamor declared during their strategy meeting. Watch how a real military commander handles rebellious slaves. But Kethamor had never fought humans before, and he made the same mistake that Zak Thul had made at the beginning of the war. He assumed that superior technology would guarantee victory against any opposition. The humans had learned not to fight the kind of war their enemies expected. Admiral Carl Baker led the human response to the planet-killer threat. Instead of trying to defend Earth directly, he launched every remaining human ship in a coordinated suicide attack against the genocide weapons. Baker knew that his fleet could not win a conventional battle, but he also knew that the aliens could not use their ultimate weapons if human ships were close enough to cause collateral damage. The space battle was unlike anything Zak Thul had ever witnessed. Human ships ignored the hegemony escorts and drove straight toward the planet killers with suicidal determination. They used ramming attacks, nuclear mines, and boarding parties in desperate attempts to disable or destroy the massive weapons platforms. Most of the human ships were destroyed, but they succeeded in preventing the deployment of the genocide weapons. On Earth's surface, Lieutenant Andy Taylor was leading resistance fighters in urban warfare that turned every street into a battlefield. The humans had learned to use the cities themselves as weapons, collapsing buildings to create barriers and using underground tunnels to move troops behind enemy lines. Taylor's forces did not try to hold territory, but focused on making the occupation as costly as possible. The psychological warfare tactics developed by Janet Phillips were having their intended effect on hegemony morale. Phillips had realized that the aliens were unprepared for the sheer brutality and determination that humans displayed in combat. She designed operations that would maximize the horror and confusion that Vorthak soldiers experienced when fighting human forces. Human fighters would disappear into civilian populations and then emerge without warning to attack alien patrols. They used improvised weapons that caused gruesome injuries and planted booby traps that were designed more to terrorize than to kill. The goal was to convince every hegemony soldier that they were fighting monsters rather than rational beings. Captain. Joe Blake had been studying captured hegemony officers and had identified a critical weakness in their military culture. The Vorthak were trained to fight honorable wars between civilized species, with clearly defined rules and objectives. They had never encountered an enemy that refused to acknowledge any limits or boundaries in warfare. Blake began organizing operations that specifically violated every rule of civilized combat. His forces targeted medical facilities, used civilian shields, and employed biological warfare using modified Earth diseases that were harmless to humans but devastating to Vorthak physiology. These tactics were morally questionable, but they were effective at breaking down alien resistance. Lieutenant Lisa Green had become an expert in capturing hegemony command ships through tactics that should have been impossible. Green had realized that alien security systems were designed to stop sophisticated infiltration attempts, but were vulnerable to crude frontal assaults that relied more on violence than technology. Her boarding parties used explosives and chemical weapons to overwhelm defenders who were not prepared for such savage attacks. The turning point came when human forces successfully captured several hegemony command vessels in a coordinated operation led by Colonel Susan Moore. Moore had developed propaganda techniques that convinced captured alien troops that they were fighting an unwinnable war against an entire species of lunatics. The psychological impact of these captures rippled through the entire hegemony fleet. Zakthul watched his forces begin to disintegrate under the pressure of fighting an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with every defeat. Some Vorthak units refused direct orders, claiming that the missions were too dangerous. Others abandoned their posts without authorization. A few even attempted to defect to join human resistance groups, though most humans were too suspicious to trust alien volunteers. Kethmore's response was to implement even more brutal tactics, including the execution of his own troops for cowardice and the use of chemical weapons against civilian populations. But these measures only made the situation worse by confirming human propaganda about alien brutality and strengthening human resolve to continue fighting. Dr. Nina Wells had been working to develop biological weapons specifically designed to target Vorthak physiology. Wells had access to captured alien genetic samples and was using them to create diseases that would be lethal to the invaders but harmless to human populations. Her work was progressing rapidly, and the threat of biological warfare was causing panic among hegemony medical staff. The final blow came when Captain Steve Miller led a successful assault on one of Kethmore's planet-killer ships. Miller had packed a captured hegemony transport with every nuclear weapon the human resistance could spare and somehow managed to penetrate the massive vessel's defenses. The resulting explosion destroyed the planet killer and killed over 50,000 alien crew members. Kethmore himself was captured during the assault when human boarding parties overran the command bridge. The sight of the feared War Master being dragged away in chains by primitive humans was broadcast throughout the hegemony fleet. The psychological impact was devastating, and several alien commanders began requesting permission to withdraw from the Earth system. Zakthul realized that he was facing a choice between continuing a war that was destroying his own forces or attempting something that had never been done in hegemony history, negotiating with a species that the Empire considered primitive and inferior. The humans had demonstrated that they could not be conquered through conventional means, and the cost of exterminating them completely was becoming higher than any possible benefit. Major Rick Thompson had sent a message to the hegemony fleet that summarized the human position perfectly. The transmission was simple and direct. "We can do this forever. Can you?" Zakthul looked at the casualty reports and realized that the answer was no. The hegemony could not sustain losses at the current rate indefinitely. His own people were beginning to question whether Earth was worth the price they were paying to conquer it. The humans had turned their technological disadvantage into a strategic advantage by making the war so costly that victory became meaningless. For the first time in his military career, Zak-Thul began to consider the possibility of retreat. The thought was almost unthinkable for a Vorthak commander, but the alternative was the complete destruction of his fleet and the humiliation of his entire species. The humans had taught him that there were some wars that could not be won through superior firepower alone. The meeting took place aboard a neutral vessel that had been provided by the Galactic Council. Zak-Thul had never imagined that he would find himself sitting across a negotiation table from Admiral Jake Morrison, but the human leader had agreed to discuss terms for ending the war. Morrison looked older than he had at the beginning of the conflict, with new scars on his face and gray hair that had turned completely white, but his eyes still held the same fierce determination that had made him so dangerous. Morrison was not alone. He had brought several other human commanders, including Captain Lisa Rodriguez, Colonel Pete Williams, and Dr. Nina Wells. Each of them represented different aspects of the human war effort, and Zak-Thul recognized many of their names from intelligence reports. These were the people who had turned his simple conquest into a nightmare that had lasted for over 2 years. "Commander Zak-Thul," Morrison said in a voice that was calm, but carried an undertone of steel. "I understand you wish to discuss the terms of your withdrawal from our solar system." Zak-Thul felt his pride sting at the human's casual assumption that the hegemony forces would be the ones withdrawing, but he could not deny the reality of his situation. His fleet was down to less than half its original strength. His troops were demoralized and refusing orders, and his superiors were demanding explanations that he could not provide. "The hegemony is prepared to consider a cessation of hostilities," Zak-Thul replied carefully. "Your species has proven to be more resilient than our initial assessments indicated." Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Resilient. Is that what you call it when we turn your own weapons against you and capture your command ships? When we make your soldiers afraid to leave their barracks? When we force you to spend more resources conquering one small planet than you used to conquer entire star systems?" Dr. Wells leaned forward and spoke in a voice that was soft, but somehow more terrifying than Morrison's open hostility. "We have been studying your people for 2 years now, Commander. We know about your military doctrine, your psychology, your weaknesses. We know that your species depends on technological superiority because you have forgotten how to fight wars that require sacrifice and determination." Colonel Williams added his own observation. "Your people fight wars to achieve goals, territory, resources, political advantages. When the cost becomes too high, you withdraw and find easier targets. But we are not fighting for goals, Commander. We are fighting for the right to exist as a free species. That is not something we can compromise on." Captain Rodriguez had been silent during the opening exchanges, but now she spoke with quiet intensity. "You came here thinking you could take our world because your ships were bigger and your weapons were stronger. You never bothered to ask whether we would let you have it. That was your first mistake, and it cost you everything." Zak-Thul looked around the table at these humans and realized that he was facing something his military training had never prepared him for. These were not defeated enemies seeking terms for surrender. They were victors who were offering him a chance to avoid further humiliation. The balance of power in the negotiation was completely opposite to what he had expected. "What are your terms?" he asked finally. Morrison's answer was simple and non-negotiable. "Complete withdrawal of all hegemony forces from our solar system. No return visits, no surveillance, no further contact of any kind. In exchange, we will not pursue your retreating forces or attempt to extract revenge for what you have done to our world. And if we refuse?" Morrison's smile became genuinely terrifying. "Then we continue the war until every one of your ships is scrap metal and every one of your soldiers is dead. We have learned how to fight your kind of war, Commander, and we are very good at it. The question is whether you want to find out how much better we can get." Dr. Wells opened a data pad and showed Zak-Thul images that made his blood run cold. "We have been reverse engineering your technology and adapting it to our own purposes. These are prototype ships that we are building in hidden facilities throughout the outer solar system. They are designed specifically to fight hegemony vessels using everything we have learned about your weaknesses. The ships in the images looked like nothing Zak Thul had ever seen. They were ugly, asymmetrical vessels that seemed to have been designed by someone who understood function but cared nothing for aesthetics. They bristled with weapons that combined human ingenuity with captured hegemony technology in ways that should not have been possible. We have also been studying the locations of your other colonies and military bases, Colonel Williams added casually. If this war continues, it will not remain confined to our solar system. We know where you live, Commander, and we know how to get there. The threat was clear and terrifying. The humans were not just defending their own world anymore. They were preparing to take the war to hegemony space and fight it on terms that would favor human tactics over alien technology. The thought of human raiders attacking Vorthak colonies with the same savage determination they had shown on Earth was enough to make Zak Thul's scales crawl with fear. Captain Rodriguez spoke again, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had fought in every major battle of the war. Your people are already breaking, Commander. We have prisoners who tell us that hegemony soldiers are refusing combat assignments and requesting transfers away from Earth. How long do you think your military discipline will last when word spreads about what humans are capable of? Zak Thul knew she was right. The psychological damage that this war had inflicted on his forces was unprecedented in hegemony military history. Vorthak soldiers, who had once been confident and disciplined, were now showing signs of what humans called post-traumatic stress. The very idea of fighting humans had become a source of terror among his troops. We accept your terms, Zak Thul said finally. The words felt like poison in his mouth, but he had no choice. Continuing the war would only lead to greater disasters. Morrison nodded as if he had expected this outcome. Wise decision, Commander. You have 48 hours to begin your withdrawal. Any hegemony vessel that remains in our solar system after that deadline will be considered hostile and treated accordingly. The negotiations concluded quickly after that. There were details to work out regarding the transfer of prisoners and the recovery of salvageable equipment, but the major points were settled. The hegemony would retreat and the humans would allow them to leave without pursuit. As Zak Thul prepared to return to his ship, Morrison stopped him with a final comment. Commander, I want you to understand something. This war was never about conquest or territory or resources. It was about whether humanity would be allowed to exist as a free species. You made the mistake of thinking that was negotiable. Back aboard his flagship, Zak Thul gave the orders for a full withdrawal from the Sol system. His officers seemed relieved rather than disappointed, which told him everything he needed to know about the state of hegemony morale. As his fleet began the long journey back to civilized space, he found himself thinking about the lessons he had learned. He had spent his entire career believing that war was about technology, tactics, and superior firepower. The humans had taught him that real war was about will and determination and the refusal to accept defeat. They had shown him that a species with primitive weapons could defeat advanced technology if they were willing to pay any price for victory. Thou, Galaxy would never be the same. Word of humanity's victory would spread throughout known space, and other species would begin to question whether the hegemony was as invincible as it claimed to be. Some would resist future conquest attempts, knowing that victory was possible if they were willing to fight like humans. But more importantly, humanity had proven that they belonged among the stars. They had fought off an invasion by one of the galaxy's major powers and forced a negotiated settlement on their own terms. They would not remain confined to their single world much longer. Zak Thul looked back at the blue planet that had cost him his career and his reputation. Earth was already beginning to rebuild, but he knew that the humans were also preparing for future conflicts. They had learned to fight galactic-level warfare, and they would not forget those lessons. The hegemony had created its own worst enemy by attacking a species that refused to be conquered. In trying to add Earth to their empire, they had instead introduced a new player to galactic politics who would challenge the established order wherever they found it. The humans were coming to the stars, and they would bring their own brand of warfare with them.